Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2 for a dig into Syrian Mechanised Infantry. What weapons, equipment and vehicles they're kitted out with, how they're organised and how to get the best out of them. Spoiler alert, the last part is really difficult. This is long enough without me stopping to explain a lot of technical details on how some of the kit works. All that stuff is in the technical bits video I've done, which I'll link in the description down below if you want to know what shape charge weapons are and all that kind of stuff. First off, it's important to understand that Syrian Mechanised Infantry is a catch-all term for a few different battalion-sized formations in the force selector. Mechanised Infantry comes in BTR and BMP flavours, for which there are also Reserve Mechanised Infantry equivalents, and then there are Guards Mechanised Infantry battalions. These are similar enough in organisation and equipment to lump together here, but what's interesting is that these differences come about because of the way that the Syrian army is tiered. At the top of the food chain for human material and the latest military equipment are the Republican Guard and Special Forces units. This is the tier of the Syrian army that is tasked with protecting the regime, potentially from the rest of the Syrian army. So these are the highest quality formations the Syrians put into the field. There have been 6 military-led coups d'etats in Syria since the end of World War II, so it's no surprise that the regime buttresses its position by creating units like the Republican Guard that are not only made up of loyalists, but have the combat power to beat down any rebellion by the main threat to the regime, the Syrian army. Regular mechanised infantry units stand at the middle tier and are a generation behind the Republican Guard in arms and equipment. So, for example, where Guards armour units cruise around in T-72s, regular Syrian army units are more likely to be 10 years behind in the T-62. This isn't entirely to do with keeping the regime protectors in an unassailable position. There are also significant economic incentives. Obviously, it's cheaper to maintain the best formations with the best material and hand down the last generation of arms and equipment as it gets replaced by new models than it is to totally re-equip the entire army with fancy new kit every time something new comes out. Finally, the bottom tier of the Syrian army is made up of reserve units, which, you may have guessed, have the hand-me-downs and cast-offs from regular army units. A lot of similar logic prevails here. The reserve units are dispersed all over the country where it's harder to keep an eye on them, unlike the more centralised Praetorians of the Republican Guard, so it makes sense to limit the potential trouble the reserves and militia can cause by only giving them outdated equipment. Again, this makes it cheaper than re-equipping them, but it also saves on retraining. It's not a problem for reserve units to be armed with old kit, because that's what they would train to operate back when they were conscripts in the regular army. So what we're going to do here is take a look at a middle tier mechanised infantry battalion BMP, and as we're going along we're going to point out how and where a Guards mechanised infantry battalion takes things up a notch and where a reserve mechanised infantry battalion takes things down a notch. Just as we did with the Striker infantry battalion for Black Sea, we're going to start off at the bottom and we're going to build up from there. This is less straightforward than it seems. There is an organisational bottom to the formation, but this is not necessarily the bottom of the formation in terms of tactical building blocks. In other words, just because platoons can be split down into squads, it doesn't necessarily follow that individual squads have enough combat power to be tactically useful on their own. This will make more sense as we go on here, but for now we're going to start off with the organisational bottom of the Syrian Mechanised Infantry, the squad. These squads are 7 men strong and are armed with 5 AKMSs, which are simply folding stock versions of the AKM, a PK machine gun, and an RPG-7. There's not much to say about the AKMs and the PK. The small arms are relatively interchangeable, especially in the way they get increasingly effective as the ranges get shorter. The PK has a longer barrel, fires a more powerful round, can set up on a bipod, and comes with a 100-round box magazine, so this means that it is, in theory, able to put suppressive fire down at longer ranges. This isn't massively important, simply because, in common with almost all small arms, actually distinguishing a specific target at long range is difficult. As usual, just because the weapon is physically capable doesn't mean that the human operator can exploit that capability. The RPG-7 deserves a little more attention. It is what it says on the tin. It is a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The launcher itself is man-portable and has no setup time, so Pixel Tripping can just point and shoot. In Shock Force 2, the rockets can be fired out to 600 meters and come in two flavors: the classic PG-7V Heat, which is a 93mm shaped charge rocket for anti-tank and anti-vehicle work, and the OG-7V Fragmentation rocket for infantry targets. The PG-7V is effective against light vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles, and while it's unlikely to destroy modern NATO main battle tanks outright, it is capable of stripping off external systems, dealing minor damage, or scoring firepower or mobility kills by damaging the gun tracks respectively. It's a single-stage, high-explosive anti-tank warhead, so it's going to struggle against targets with explosive reactive armour or slat armour, but slat armour isn't 100% effective. Sometimes the shape shards gets through, and era blocks not only don't cover entire vehicles, but individual blocks are one use. They can stop a single RPG hit, then they're gone, and there's a gap in the armour. So like all lighter AT weapons, it's worth massing RPGs to hit tough targets when they need to be worn down a bit before they can be destroyed. The OG-7V Frag rocket is pretty self-explanatory. The closer the rocket detonates to the enemy, the more of them it's going to spray with shrapnel and the more casualties it's going to cause. This is better at anti-infantry work than the PG-7V, but not in a way that makes it particularly competitive. Although the heat warhead's main purpose is to produce a molten jet to penetrate armour, the explosion needed sends fragments of the casing out in all directions, and the blast is enough to pick up everything that is nearby and loose, including, but not limited to, gravel, stones, assorted chunks of debris, and fling it at anyone nearby at very high speed in a way that is very unhealthy. In short, the heat rocket is almost as good an anti-infantry weapon as the fragmentation rocket, whilst also being able to perform in the anti-tank role, so if you ever have to decide which rockets your Pixel Trippin should carry, it's a no-brainer. Finally, the RPG can be fired indoors without burning everybody with a backblast. It's not fun, anyone nearby is going to be suppressed, but it can be done. That's the Infantry Squad at the bottom of the Syrian Mechanised Infantry Battalion. 7 guys, a PK machine gun and an RPG. They don't have any fancy equipment like body armour, night vision devices, or, importantly, radios. If they want to stay in contact to pass on and receive information with their platoon HQ, then they either need to be within shouting or hand signal distance, or they need to be near their vehicle, which does have a radio. In reserve Mechanised Infantry Squads, the PK is replaced by the RPD, which is an older weapon that fills the same role, but in more of a squad automatic weapon or light machine gun capacity than the PK, which is more of a general purpose machine gun. The squad is mounted in an infantry fighting vehicle, dependent on what formation it's in. We're dealing with a Mechanised Infantry BMP battalion, so our squad is mounted in a BMP 1P. The key phrase here is infantry fighting vehicle. When the Soviets developed and deployed the BMP-1 back in the 1960s, it was revolutionary. Everybody else was sending their infantry to war in battle taxis like the M113, vehicles which were lightly armoured, lightly armed, and designed to get the infantry from point A to point B and drop them off to do the fighting themselves. The BMP-1P isn't a simple squad transport, it's a key component of the squad's firepower, being armed with a 73mm gun, capable of firing heat and high explosive rounds, a coax medium machine gun, and an AT-4 ATGM mounted on top of the turret. This is a lot less of an impressive armament than it was when the BMP first arrived on the scene, but it's not to be scoffed at. The 73mm gun is effective against light vehicles and infantry, but it sits in an uncomfortable middle ground with too low a caliber to really dish the damage out, but too large a caliber to compensate by a high automatic rate of fire. The AT-4 mounted on the turret roof is a wire-guided Sakhalos weapon that can only be fired when the vehicle is stationary. Comes in either the AT-4A or AT-4C variants. Both have a minimum range of 70 meters. The A variant can reach out to 2 kilometers. The C variant extends the range to 2,500 meters and has a larger, more effective warhead. Neither of these are going to kill NATO tanks from the front. They aren't likely to get through slat or explosive reactive armor, but they are effective against the flanks and rear of enemy tanks and are easily capable of destroying NATO infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. Capable of is a key term with the BMP's armament because there are some serious disadvantages to the vehicle that don't immediately jump out just from looking at the technical details. The turret is very small. It's a one-man turret with a very overworked gunner who is not only operating in a very confined space, but he has to spot targets as well as fire and reload the main gun and the coax. There isn't enough room for the AT-4 and its guidance system inside the turret, so he has to open up and expose himself to enemy fire in order to operate that. Reloading is even worse because he has to ditch the spent missile case and then manhandle another one up from inside the vehicle. Add all this to an outdated optics and fire control package, and the BMP-1P has some pretty serious flaws, as you would expect for a vehicle that was cutting edge 50 years ago. In terms of protection, the BMP-1P is proof against the 50 caliber machine gun fire from the front thanks to the very steep plug of the armour, and is well protected against small arms fire and artillery fragments. That's about it though. Pretty much all high-explosive anti-tank weapons will punch holes in it from any angle. Even NATO 40mm HEDP grenades fired from underbarrel grenade launchers can get through the armour. This is a problem because there is a lot of stuff inside the BMP that does not react well to being shot at. The downside to the relatively heavy armament is that there is a lot of ammunition inside the hull beneath the turret, 40 rounds for the 73mm gun and 4 ATGM reloads. To add to the fun, the passengers sit back to back on the main fuel tank, which is incidentally right next to the ammunition, and the rear doors are also full of fuel. So, spoiler alert, if you have a BMP that suffers a penetrating hit, it is probably going to either violently explode as the ammunition cooks off, or violently incinerate as the fuel catches fire, or it's going to do both at the same time. Despite sounding like a complete death trap, these characteristics of the BMP are actually very sensible design decisions made by the Soviets back in the 1960s. The BMP was designed for the nuclear battlefield. The Soviets didn't see a lot of point in holding back if the Cold War got hot. They were going to plaster Western Europe with nuclear weapons, and they expected NATO to do the same, leaving the whole theatre as a seething radioactive mess with the added spice of copious chemical weapons floating around. In those circumstances, any penetration means that the occupants of the vehicle are going to die anyway. Much better to sacrifice some armour for the extra speed and mobility that you need to cross the irradiated battlefield quickly and minimise exposure. Fuel makes a surprisingly good radiation shield too, so why not put some fuel tanks in the rear door and help protect the troops? Another interesting relic from the Cold War context in which the BMP conceived is that the passengers in the back can fire their weapons from inside using the side-mounted firing ports. This actually works in Shock Force 2, which I was not expecting because it's a really bad idea. Hitting anything beyond short range is impossible, especially when the vehicle is moving. This is much more about putting out suppressive fire. Given that the BMP is a crematorium waiting to happen, staying inside it in a modern world of abundant man-portable anti-tank weapons while enemy infantry is in close proximity is not worth it, no matter how cool you think it is to try and perform drive-by shootings. Having the infantry being able to engage the enemy without leaving their vehicles makes perfect sense on the nuclear battlefield because it limits the infantry's radiation exposure. Outside of the Cold War context, it makes a lot less sense. In terms of mobility, a BMP moving fast in a straight line can go about 1,000 metres in a turn on road or about 750 metres off-road, so it's pretty nippy. It's not very fast in reverse, which is important to bear in mind if you're trying to play shoot and scoot. And finally, it's amphibious, so it can cross water obstacles without too many problems. A couple of other details to bear in mind include the fact that the BMP-1P has smoke launchers. These are Soviet-style smoke launchers, so they fire about 100 metres ahead of the vehicle to give it room to manoeuvre, unlike NATO-style smoke, which deploys immediately around the vehicle as a comparatively passive protective measure. The smoke is not multispectral, which is a very fancy way of saying that it doesn't block thermal optics, it just blocks the Mark I human eyeball. The BMP is also a very low-slung vehicle. For an APC, it has a very low profile. This is good because it makes it a smaller target, but this puts the turret at about head height, which is something to bear in mind if you have infantry out in front of the vehicle and you don't want them to get shot in the back of the head. Finally, it has a crew of 2, a driver and a gunner, and can carry up to 9 passengers. This means that when the standard infantry squad of 7 pixel tripod is mounted up, there are 2 free seats. So having 2 free seats gives you a couple of options if you're selecting your own force and you want your infantry squads to have a bit more teeth. There are a few 2-man size specialist teams like snipers, AA teams and RPG teams that you can attach to the platoon for extra support if you want. The passengers get in and out via the rear doors, the ones with the fuel tanks in them, but the squad leader has to climb into a hatch behind the driver, which is something to bear in mind when you're disembarking. The squad leader sits there instead of with his squad because this way he can better direct the vehicle and he can take advantage of the fact that it has a radio. As I've said, the BMP is not a battle taxi, it's a key component of the squad. Thinking back to organisational versus tactical building blocks, we can already see that the infantry squad isn't supposed to operate without the BMP, and the BMP isn't supposed to operate without the infantry squad. We have some degree of combined arms built into the formation already, but we still haven't reached that building block. A single infantry squad and its BMP isn't the kind of force that you can really send off to operate on its own. Before we get onto the platoon organisation, we've got to run through the differences between the tiers. We've just been discussing the BMP 1P in depth. Reserve Mechanised Infantry BMP battalions are equipped with the BMP 1, which is the original version. There are two main differences, the first of which is that the BMP 1 has an AT3 ATGM mounted on top of the main gun instead of the AT4 mounted on the turret. The AT3 is an older, less effective weapon with a smaller warhead and a Machineguns type guidance system that is much more difficult to use. It's a much less effective weapon. The second difference is that the BMP-1 doesn't have any smoke launchers. Guards Mechanised Infantry are equipped with the BMP-2, which has had some significant upgrades. The most important of these are that the very unsatisfactory single-man turret has been replaced with a larger two-man version. The squad leader now sits beside the gunner instead of in the hull, where he has a much better idea of what's going on, and that the 73mm gun has been replaced with a 30mm cannon. The cannon can fire armour-piercing and high-explosive rounds at a rapid rate, and it's generally superior to the 73mm in pretty much all respects. The ATGM has also been upgraded to an AT5, which is functionally a better performing AT4, with the critical difference that the gunner doesn't need to open up. You can aim and fire the AT5 from inside the turret. The downside to the bigger turret is a small decrease in passenger capacity. There's only enough room for 8 pixel truppen in the back now, which means you don't have enough room to assign extra teams to the squads. Also worth mentioning here is that the Syrian Mechanised Infantry formations can also be equipped with BTRs instead of BMPs. The BTR in question is the BTR-60PB variant, which is an 8-wheeled APC armed with a KPBT heavy machine gun and a coaxial PK in a tiny one-man turret that suffers from the same problems as the one-man BMP turret for the same reasons. It can carry 9 men like the BMP-1 and the BMP-1P, who get in and out via hatches on the roof. This is as time-consuming as it is dangerous, and really not something you want to be trying under fire or when the vehicle has taken a hit. Speaking of which, the BTR is proof against small arms, but that's about it. On the plus side, it's not as full of fuel and ammunition as the BMP, so when it gets hit by something unpleasant, chances are that everybody inside just dies instead of exploding or incinerating. Just to be clear on this front, vulnerable APCs and IFVs are not some kind of unique Soviet problem. Any lightly armoured vehicle on the battlefield is very vulnerable. It doesn't matter who's operating them, if they get hit with a full squad inside, they become an instant crematorium. The BTR has worse off-road performance than the BMP, only going about 600 metres in a turn instead of 750, but it's comparably fast on road. As pointed out, the BTR isn't a real infantry fighting vehicle like the BMP, it's much more of a battle taxi. BTR-equipped formations have significantly less firepower than BMP-equipped ones, but they're cheaper in return. That's the vehicle variants. There are 2 BMP-mounted squads in a platoon, and these are led by a command squad, which is kitted out in the same way as the infantry squads, complete with BMP, except the squad leader is also the platoon leader, and there's an extra pixel truppen with an SVD marksman's rifle. Once again, this is just another small arm, and while it does have an optic, the shooter's capacity to see and hit distant targets that don't want to get shot restricts its usefulness a lot more than the physical capabilities of the weapon. So we've got our platoon of 3 infantry squads mounted in BMPs. Have we found our tactical building block? 3 is a funny number because you can't split it very well. You'll always have one BMP in a squad left on its own and unable to really function effectively. It's awkward to try and perform something like bounding Overwatch with a 3-unit platoon because you'll be sacrificing firepower if you leave a single unit to cover the advance, or you'll be sacrificing speed if you only move 1 unit at a time. Western NATO-style mechanised infantry platoons have 3 squads, but the platoon HQ rides in a 4th vehicle, meaning you can split the platoon into 2 equal elements and leapfrog without having to make sacrifices to speed or firepower. We can't split our 3-unit Syrian platoon, so we have to use this platoon in a single block. If we want to advance with foreign movement, we need to get another platoon. There are 3 mechanized infantry platoons in a company, which means that we've gone all the way up to company level before we can start breaking the formation down into separate useful chunks of combat power. This is an interesting aspect of the battalion's organisation in that it consistently leads you upwards and encourages you to mass combat power in a way that NATO-style organisation doesn't. Where it's reasonable with the NATO factions to send a platoon, with the Syrians you're led into sending 2 platoons. Where a NATO 3-platoon company can reasonably spread itself out across a few tasks, our Syrian Mech Infantry 3-platoon company lends itself to be concentrated on just one. Concentration of combat power is pretty much built into the battalion's organisation in a very simple and very effective way, but this comes at the cost of flexibility. The company also has a weapons platoon, which consists of 2 Machinegun sections, each with 2 tripod-mounted PKMs. These follow the same kind of principles as small arms, in that they are much more effective at short range than they are at long, and that their suppressive effect is just as, if not more, important than their killing potential. The weapons platoon also has an Igla team for air defense. Man-portable, shoulder-launched SAMs like the Igla are best used en masse because they're not tremendously effective individually, but they're not useless, and some AA is better than no AA. The weapons platoon rides around in 2 more BMPs, which are probably capable of putting more fire out between them than the 4 PKMs, though obviously a 3-man machine gun team is easier to hide than an infantry fighting vehicle. Finally, the company command element comes as a 3-man HQ. That's the company commander, the XO, and a radio operator, and a command squad armed with a PKM, all of whom are carted around in another BMP. The battalion has 3 of these companies, which are supported by a forward observer team, a Recon Platoon, a weapons company, and a heavy mortar battery. The forward observer team consists of a forward observer, funnily enough, a radio operator, and someone to carry their sandwiches and drive them around in their little UAZ jeep. The FO's job is to direct artillery and mortar support. Again, we're seeing a significant difference to the way that NATO handles artillery direction. US mechanized infantry companies, for example, have an FO in each platoon, which means you have a lot of built-in flexibility. In fact, pretty much any NATO unit can call for fire right down to fire team leaders. It might take them a while, it's not very efficient, but they can do it. With the Syrian forces, only officers and forward observers can call for fire, and it takes officers much longer than FOs. There simply isn't the same kind of quick access to artillery that NATO has, but yet again we're being led into concentrating our effort. Trying to spread fire out around different targets is going to be very slow and very inefficient. With a single FO, we're much better going big and going ugly in support of the main effort. The Recon Platoon consists of 2 BMPs carrying a HQ element armed with an SVD, 2 4-man recon teams armed purely with AKMs, and an ATGM team. The ATGM in the regular Syrian Mechanized Infantry Battalion and the reserves is an AT4A, which is the same option as it is on the BMP-1P, so sack loss, wire guidance, single-stage heat. Guards formations are equipped with the AT7, which has half the range, but is otherwise the same but better in all respects. The weapons company breaks down into an anti-tank platoon and an anti-air platoon, commanded by a HQ element split between 2 UAZ jeeps with an RPG as backup. The anti-tank platoon consists of 3 ATGM teams armed with AT3Bs, AT3Cs, AT4As, or AT4Cs. Again, these are the same weapons that are mounted on the BMP-1 and BMP-1P. The short version is that the higher the number and the higher the letter, the better it is. Guards anti-tank platoons have access to AT-13s, which are much more modern, much more accurate, and mount a tandem heat warhead capable of defeating explosive reactive armour. They have a shorter range at 1500 metres rather than 2000, but actually finding a 2000 metre long field of fire in your average combat mission game, and having an enemy unit be considerate enough to sit there in full view is pretty rare, so that's not much of a big deal. The AA platoon consists of 4 pickup trucks, each mounting a ZU-23-2 23mm twin autocannon for anti-aircraft use. Target acquisition, aiming and tracking are all completely manual, as compared to dedicated AA vehicles like the Shilka, which use radar and computerized fire control systems, so low expectations are the way forward here. They can be used against ground targets, but they are extremely fragile and armed only with armour-piercing incendiary rounds rather than the HE rounds that would make them super effective against infantry. Nevertheless, if they can get the first shot in on enemy light vehicles, they are capable of getting the lead out and doing some damage. They have a high rate of fire. The heavy mortar battery is made up of 2 3 mortar platoons. These are 120mm mortars, so they do pack a punch, but on map they have a minimum range of 460 meters to bear in mind. They are also considerably more accurate when they are on map than if they are off map, which is also important. In terms of ammunition, each on-map mortar carries 11 high explosive bombs and is carried in a truck which carries another 48 high explosive for a total of 59 and 6 smoke bombs. If you select the mortars as off-map assets, then you get a 3-tube fire support option with only 72 rounds, so you'll get more ammo if you stay on map. If you have the NATO module, you can choose whether the mortar teams travel in Ural or ZIL trucks if you want. Apparently the Ural is faster, but the ZIL is better off-road. They fit the same amount of pixel chopping in the back, they carry the same amount of ammunition, so to me it seems like an aesthetic choice. Your mileage may vary, I don't really care. Finally, the entire battalion is commanded by a 6-man battalion HQ carried in a BMP 1PK. This is the command variant of the BMP 1P, which is exactly the same, it just has extra radios in it. The same goes for the guards, which is going to be the BMP 2K. Very simple. So, that's the Syrian Mechanised Infantry Battalion. What's the best way to use it? In a lot of ways, the Syrians share the problem of the Russians in Black Sea, in that they're kind of shortchanged by combat mission because the game is operating beneath the scale that they are built to work at. This is a tactical war game that is very much concerned with battalion-sized formations and below. This Mechanised Infantry Battalion isn't just designed to be kept together and wielded in a single overwhelming chunk of combat power, but it's designed to work as part of a much larger regimental or divisional formation that is beyond the scope of a combat mission game. Soviet doctrine, which is what this formation is based around, isn't tremendously bothered with the small tactical scale of combat mission. It's looking for operational victories won by rapid advances in depth, characterized by ruthless reinforcement of success. Under this style of warfare, if our Syrian Mechanised Infantry Battalion has been the most successful in the division, then it gets every possible support and the commitment of the divisional reserve to exploit. If our Syrian Mechanised Infantry Battalion runs into a strong defence and makes little progress, then it not only gets nothing, but it might even have assets stripped out to reinforce a more successful unit. NATO forces responded to this kind of Soviet doctrine by developing their forces to compete tactically, to fight outnumbered and win. So when you get a war game focused on the tactical level, it shouldn't be too surprising when NATO comes out on top, especially when you consider that the military equipment being employed by the Syrians here is at least a couple of generations behind modern NATO equipment. In other words, the Syrians are going to have serious difficulties because not only are their NATO opponents built to exploit their tactical disadvantages, but their formations are not built with the kind of flexibility that would let you use them very effectively in any way except the way they've been designed. It's a messy, nasty catch-22. NATO forces in Shock Force 2 have a major qualitative advantage over the Syrians. Better optics, better fire control systems, and professional soldiers usually translate into NATO forces spotting faster, engaging faster, and hitting their targets faster. Modern weapons are so lethal that one shot or one burst is frequently all it takes to leave a BMP on fire or exploding without it ever seeing what killed it. As such, and in keeping with the setting, Syrian forces are best when they're defending, when NATO forces will come to them. Ideally, they should be taking up positions where they can engage NATO at close range. Point-blank ambushes, exploitation of dense urban or forested terrain and reverse slopes are going to bring the best results because NATO's advantages in spotting and accuracy are less relevant at knife fighting ranges. The playing field suddenly becomes much more even. Even under these conditions, don't expect to win any prolonged firefights. It requires a lot of luck and a cooperative opponent to deliver a game-winning hammer blow to a NATO force. Most of the casualties Syrian forces inflict are likely to be within 30 seconds of them opening fire. After that, NATO can bring its firepower into play, which usually allows it to quickly build fire superiority, decimating Syrian units and pinning the survivors down. Expect to take a lot of casualties, expect to see your troops break, run, or throw down their arms and try to surrender. If you can, make sure that each strong point has a TRP in it so that when it falls, you can quickly plaster it with mortar fire. The aim is not to win the firefight, the aim is to wear the enemy down and run down the clock. If taking a single platoon position costs NATO a vehicle or two, a handful of pixel treatment and 10 minutes of game time, then a company set up in depth can hold the enemy up for half an hour or more. That's a long time in most combat mission games, and it's likely to be much longer when you factor in the time and distances between platoon strongpoints, enemy reconnaissance efforts, or time spent establishing fire support positions and calling for artillery. That's my opinion. If you're wanting to play Red 4 in Shock Force 2, then hearing that your troops are best employed as expendable speed bumps is probably not particularly inspiring, but so far I haven't found anything else that really works. In short, the Syrians are qualitatively outclassed, so they're best relying on mass to get things done and sidestepping NATO's tactical advantage by close range engagements. This is very difficult to pull off, especially given some of the maps, and especially because the tactical imbalance is so great. That said, they're still very interesting, they have some very interesting kit, and I hope you guys enjoyed this guide to the Mechanised Infantry Battalion. Don't forget to comment, rate and subscribe if you liked it. I'll catch you in the next video.